Chapter 1. Impact. The world ended in a scream of tearing metal. I didn't remember the impact. I remembered the red, flashing lights of the drop pod bay, the lurch of gravity, failing, and the deafening roar of the aurora coming apart around us. Then, the panel detached from the ceiling and slammed into my skull. Darkness. Then heat. I woke up coughing, my lungs seizing against acrid, black smoke. The air inside LifePod 5 was a solid, choking wall. An alarm blared, a jagged digital shriek that drilled into my headache. Fire. The word bypassed my conscious thought and hit my adrenaline reserves. I unbuckled, falling from the seat to the grate floor. The heat was blistering. To my left, a circuit panel was spitting sparks, igniting the insulation. The flames licked upward, hungry and orange. Fire suppression. I rasped, my voice sounding foreign in the chaos. I scrambled under the bench seat, my fingers fumbling for the extinguisher. I found the cold canister, ripped the pin, and unleashed a cloud of white chemical foam. The roar of the fire battled the hiss of the extinguisher. 410 heartbeats, I didn't know which would win. Then the orange died. The smoke lingered, swirling in the small space, but the heat began to recede. I slumped against the wall, dropping the empty canister. My head throbbed in time with the alarm. I reached up and slapped the panel to silence it. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. Status report, I said to the pod's AI. Systems initializing. A synthetic voice replied, skipping slightly. Secondary systems damaged. Hull. Integrity stable. Flotation devices deployed. Flotation? I stood up swaying. The pod was rocking gently. Not the vibration of an engine, but a fluid, rolling motion. I looked up at the hatch. The handle was glowing with a red, locked indicator, but the manual override was green. I climbed the small ladder. My hand shook as I gripped the wheel. I didn't know what was outside. Vacuum? A hostile atmosphere? The twisted wreckage of the ship? I turned the wheel. With a pneumatic hiss, the seal broke. I pushed the hatch up and climbed out. 3. The light blinded me first. It wasn't the harsh starlight of space, but a brilliant, diffusing cyan. As my eyes adjusted, the color resolved into a sky, a pale, alien blue, mostly clear save for the pillar of black smoke, rising in the distance. I stood on the roof of the life pod and looked around. Water. Endless, stretching water in every direction. It was a turquoise sheet of glass, rippling gently under a warm breeze. To the south, a massive shape dominated the horizon. The aurora. My home for the last 18 months was a ruin. The front third of the massive capital ship had been sheared off, a burning, skeletal remains jutting out of the ocean. My God, I whispered. I looked down. The water around the pod was incredibly clear. Through the surface, I could see colors, vibrant purples, acid greens, and deep reds. Coral. It was a reef. Something broke the surface near the pod. A small fish, bright pink with a giant eye in the center of its body, leaped into the air and splashed back down. I checked my PDA. Atmosphere, breathable. Oxygen/nitrogen mix. No immediate pathogens detected. I sat on the edge of the hatch, the adrenaline fading, replaced by a cold, heavy dread that not even the tropical sun could warm. I was stranded. I had no long-range comms, no food, and no water. I looked down at the alien ocean again. It looked peaceful, beautiful even, but as I stared into the gradient where the turquoise reef dropped off into a deep, dark blue void, I felt a primal shiver. The water was hiding things. I didn't know what lived on this planet, but I knew one thing for certain. I was the alien here. Chapter 2. The Shallows. The first thing I learned about this planet wasn't the geography or the biology. It was the thirst. It had only been 3 hours since the crash, but the adrenaline dump had dehydrated me faster than a desert march. My mouth tasted like copper and ash. I sat inside the life pod, staring at the storage locker eye. Had his pried open. 2 flares. A single nutrient block that looked like compressed sawdust. And a fire extinguisher. No water. I muttered, the words scraping my throat. standard survival kit, and no darn water? Altera survival packages are randomized to maximize fleet-wide resource distribution. The PDA. Chirp from my hip. The voice was female, calm, and utterly indifferent to my dying of thirst. Detecting. Multiple vital signs in critical distress. Calorie intake recommended. Hydration required immediately. Thanks, I said. Any suggestions? The surrounding ecosystem supports distinct biodiversity. Probability of potable water sources, low. Probability of synthesis via organic filtration, high. Synthesis. That meant I had to catch something. I looked at the fabricator mounted on the wall. It was the heart of the life pod, an atomic-level 3D printer, capable of rearranging molecular structures. If I brought it the raw materials, it could build anything from a battery to a heated knife. But right now, it was a dormant slab of white plastic. I grabbed the survival knife from the emergency kit, checked the seal on my environmental suit, and stepped back up the ladder. The sun was high now. The heat coming off the metal hull was intense. I looked down into the water. From up here, it was a painting, inviting, tropical, serene. But my brain screamed at me not to do it. Humans aren't meant for the ocean. We are terrestrial creatures. We fear what we can't see and beneath. That shimmering surface was a whole world I couldn't see. I took a breath, held it, and jumped. The transition was a shock of cold and sound. The splash roared in my ears, followed immediately by the muffled, rhythmic whoosh of the ocean. I opened my eyes. If the surface was beautiful, the world beneath, it was hallucinogenic. I was floating above a landscape of swaying coral tubes, some twisted like giant intestines, others flat and purple like plates. The sand was white and pristine. Sunlight cut through the water in shifting curtains of gold, illuminating schools of fish that darted in unison. A shoal of small, disc-shaped fish with translucent purple bladders drifted past me. 5. Organism detected. The PDA said in my earpiece. Local scans suggest membrane contains high concentrations of potable liquid. Common designation, bladderfish. Water. I kicked my fins, propelling myself downward. The suit was heavy, but the buoyancy compensators made me feel weightless. I reached out for the nearest bladderfish. It was slow, drifting lazily. I closed my hand, and it vanished. It darted away with a burst of speed that left me grasping at bubbles. Darn it. I checked my oxygen gauge on the HUD inside my mask. 45 seconds. I kicked harder, chasing another one. This time, I didn't reach out until I was right on top of it. My glove brushed its slimy side. I snatched it, feeling the membrane squish unpleasantly in my grip. I shoved it into the secure pouch on my thigh. I needed one more thing. I swam toward a rough patch of rock where a limestone chunk protruded like a wart. I struck it with the butt of my knife. The rock cracked open, revealing a glittering lump of metal. Titanium. Oxygen, the PDA warned. The edges of my vision were starting to gray. I looked up. The surface was a shimmering mirror 20 feet above. I kicked upward, my lungs burning, fighting the panic that whispered I wouldn't make it. I broke the surface, gasping. The air tasted sweet. I dragged myself back onto the life pod, dripping and exhausted, clutching my alien prizes. Inside the pod, the fabricator hummed to life as I approached. I placed the bladderfish on the analysis tray. I tried not to look at its large, unblinking eye. The machine scanned it, a blue laser grid sweeping over the organic matter. Processing, the voice said. The machine whirred. There was a flash of light, a distinct zap, and the fish was gone. In the output slot sat a sleek, clear bottle of water. I cracked the seal and drained it in one go. It was lukewarm and had a slight aftertaste of saline, but it was the best thing I had ever tasted. My head cleared. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. I had water. Now I needed to know what was out there. I placed the titanium I'd harvested into the tray, along with a battery I'd scavenged from the pods. Damaged secondary systems. I selected the blueprint on the touchscreen. Scanner. The fabricator sang its song of creation. Lasers danced, knitting metal and plastic together from the atomic level up. In 10 seconds, a heavy, handheld tool lay in the tray. I picked it up. It felt solid. This was my way forward. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a scientist. Again, I spent the next few hours in a rhythm. Dive. Scan. Surface. I scanned the acid mushrooms, large, dangerous-looking fungal growths that leaked potent chemicals. I scanned the peepers, rapid, giant-eyed fish that seemed to be the primary food source for the local predators. And I saw the predators. I was near a kelp forest, a dense thicket of green vines reaching from the seabed to the surface, when I heard it, a metallic, grinding roar. I froze, floating behind a large coral tube. A long, serpentine creature wove through the vines. It had a snout like a crocodile and a body shimmering, with blue and purple scales. It was playing with a piece of metal salvage from the Aurora, tossing the scrap iron around like a dog with a bone. Stalker, the PDA whispered, logging the entry. Aggressive fauna. Attraction to titanium deposits. Detected. I backed away slowly, careful not to disturb the water. I was an intruder in their house. I had to remember that. By the time I climbed back into the life pod, the sky was turning a bruised purple. The giant red sun was dipping below the horizon, and the massive hulk of the Aurora was silhouetted against the dying light. I sat on the floor of the pod, eating the nutrient block. It was dry and tasteless, but it stopped my stomach from cramping. Outside, the light faded completely. I expected the ocean to go silent at night. I was wrong. Through the thin metal hull, I heard them. New sounds, deep, resonant clicks, high-pitched shrieks that sounded uncomfortably human. And far off, in the direction of the deep water, a low, moaning roar that vibrated through the floor of the pod and into my bones. I looked at the hatch. It was locked, but it felt flimsy. I pulled up the PDA and looked at the data I had gathered. I was alone. I was on a planet categorized as 4546b, and based on the biological data I'd just scanned, there was a very high probability that something down there was big enough to swallow this life pod whole. I gripped the scanner tight, watching the red light of the hatch blink in the darkness. Day 1, I whispered to the empty air. Survived. Chapter 3, The Kelp Forest. The sun rose like a hammer. There was no dawn, just a sudden shift from pitch black to blinding cyan as the star crested the horizon. I hadn't slept. Every time I drifted off, the pod would bump against something or a shriek would echo through the hull, jerking me back to a terrified wakefulness. I sat up, my back stiff against the metal grating. My mouth was dry again. The single bottle of water from yesterday was a distant memory. Calorie intake recommended. The PDA chirped. Shut up, I muttered. I checked the fabricator. I had the blueprint for a standard O2 tank, but I needed more titanium. And to get titanium efficiently, I needed to cover more ground. Swimming with just my hands and feet was like trying to run through molasses. I was burning oxygen just trying to get to the bottom. I tapped the screen. Fins. Ingredients. 2x silicone rubber. Silicone rubber can be synthesized from the seed clusters of local creepvine flora the PDA supplied. I knew what creepvines were. They were the tall, swaying stalks of kelp I'd seen yesterday. The domain of the stalkers. I looked at the survival knife on my belt. It was a standard issue Altera blade, hardened steel, weighted. Grip, serrated edge. Against a shark, it was a toothpick, but it was all I had. I ate half of my last nutrient block, drank the last few drops of water I'd synthesized, and opened the hatch. The water felt colder today. Or maybe I was just tired. I swam toward the green murk in the distance. As I left the safety of the shallow coral tubes, the water changed. The crystal-clear blue gave way to a hazy, particulate-filled green. The visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet. The creepvine forest was a vertical maze. The vines were thick as my leg, stretching up from the seabed toward the sun, their broad leaves creating a canopy that dappled the light. It was beautiful in a haunting, claustrophobic way. I spotted what I needed immediately. Creepvine seed clusters. They were impossible to miss, bulbous, glowing yellow sacs growing in bunches along the stalks. They looked radioactive in the dim water. I kicked toward the nearest stalk. I was 10 feet away when the water to my left displaced violently. 8. Grind. Snap. A stalker erupted from the dense vines. It was sleek, a torpedo of muscle and teeth. It ignored me, darting past my face, so close I felt the wake. Against my mask, it slammed into a piece of metal salvage resting on the sand, a chunk of the Aurora's hull plating. The creature bit down on the metal, its jaw unhinging slightly, and shook it violently. I froze, hovering in the water column. Don't move. Don't look like prey. The stalker thrashed the metal, then dropped it. It circled, its long, crocodile-like snout sniffing the water. Its eyes, 4 of them, glowing slightly, swept the area. It saw me. The creature stopped. Its fins flared. It let out a low, clicking growl that vibrated in my chest. I slowly reached for the knife. My heart was hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought it would crack. Nice doggy, I whispered into my regulator. The stalker shrieked, a high, piercing sound, and charged. I didn't think. I reacted. I kicked hard to the right, putting a thick cluster of vines between us. The stalker smashed through the vegetation, its jaws snapping on the empty water where my leg had been a second ago. I scrambled toward the seabed. There was a small cave system, a tunnel beneath the root structure of the vines. I jammed myself into the opening. The stalker slammed into the rock entrance. It was too big to fit. It gnashed its teeth at me, scraping the limestone, its snout inches from my face. I could see the rows of serrated teeth, the milky film over its eyes. It thrashed for a moment longer, stirring up a cloud of silt, then lost interest. It turned and swam back to its piece of scrap metal. I checked my O2. 30 seconds. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I waited until the stalker was distracted by the metal again. Then, I launched myself out of the hole. I swam straight up toward the glowing yellow seeds on the stalk above me. I grabbed a cluster. It was heavy and warm. I slashed the stem with my knife, severing it. I grabbed a second one for good measure. The stalker roared below me. It had seen the motion. I didn't look back. I kicked for the surface, clutching the glowing seeds to my chest. The water churned. Behind me, I expected to feel teeth closing around my ankle at any second. I broke the surface and scrambled onto a piece of floating reef, gasping. Nothing followed me up. The water below settled. Back at the life pod, my hand was shaking as I fed the yellow clusters into the fabricator. The machine hummed, breaking down the organic material and resequencing it. A moment later, too, rolls of translucent, orange rubber appeared in the tray. I selected the fin's blueprint. The fabricator worked quickly. When it was done, I held them up. They were black, sleek, and long with the orange silicone woven into the propulsion lining. I stripped off my boots and pulled the fins on. They locked into place around my ankles with a satisfying magnetic click. I dropped back into the water. The difference was instant. One kick sent me gliding forward with powerful momentum. I felt like a seal. I twisted, turned, and dove, covering in 10 seconds what used to take me 30. I wasn't just drifting anymore. I was swimming. I surfaced, feeling a rare surge of triumph. I had speed now. I could outrun the stalkers. I could go deeper. Detecting massive energy spike, the PDA interrupted my victory. I looked south. The Aurora was groaning. The pillar of smoke that had been rising from it since yesterday had turned. Blacker, thicker, blue sparks of electricity, massive as lightning bolts, were arcing across the shattered bow. Drive core containment is critical, the voice said, detached and calm. Quantum detonation imminent. Countdown, T-minus 60 minutes. The Triumph vanished. The ship wasn't just broken. It was a nuclear bomb, and I was sitting in a blast zone. Chapter 4, The Shattered Sky. The countdown was a death sentence delivered in a polite, mid-Atlantic accent. I stood on the roof of Life Pod 5, my new fins resting heavily against the hull. For 59 minutes, I watched the aurora. It was a monument to human hubris, a multi-billion credit vessel now reduced to a jagged tomb of titanium and dark matter. The air around the ship didn't just look hot, it looked wrong. The atmosphere was shimmering, distorted by gravitational leakage. 30 seconds to 0, the PDA announced. Please seek shelter or brace for impact. I didn't seek shelter. I couldn't move. I was mesmerized by the sheer scale of the coming catastrophe. At 0, the sound didn't come first. The light did. A sphere of pure, blinding white erupted from the ship's midsection. It swallowed the hull, the sky, and the ocean in a silent flash. Then the shockwave hit. It was a physical wall of pressure that knocked me off my feet and slammed me against the pod's hatch. A moment later, the sound arrived. A roar so profound it wasn't a noise, but a vibration that threatened to liquefy my internal organs. The Aurora's drive core had finally given up the ghost. A column of fire and debris shot kilometers into the sky, punching a hole through the clouds. Then came the rain. Not water, but glowing hot metal. I scrambled into the pod and slammed the hatch shut just as the first chunks of the ship began to pelt the ocean like meteors. The pod rocked violently, the flotation bladders groaning under the strain of the turbulent water. Warning, the PDA said, its voice flickering with static. Quantum detonation has resulted in a massive leak of radioactive material. Local radiation levels are exceeding lethal limits. How long? I shouted over the sound of the metal rain hitting the hull. Estimated time to organ failure, 24 hours. Crafting of lead line protective gear is strongly advised. The panic was a cold weight in my gut, but it was a familiar weight now. Fear was just another resource to manage. I needed lead. I needed fiber mesh. And I needed them before the invisible poison in the air cooked me. From inside out, I dove. The water was no longer a sanctuary. Above, the surface was a chaotic mess of sinking debris and ash. Below, the reef was agitated. The fish were darting in erratic patterns, sensing the shift in the planet's energy. I pushed toward the edge of the shallows, toward a new biome I hadn't dared explore yet, the grassy plateaus. 11. Here, the seabed dropped away to a depth of about 100 meters. Massive pillar-like rock formations rose from the floor, topped with thick carpets of blood-red seagrass that swayed in the deep currents. It was beautiful, but the open space made me feel exposed. Detecting sandstone outcrops, the PDA noted. I saw them, smooth, tan-colored rocks nestled among the red grass. I kicked downward my new fins, slicing through the water with effortless power. I smashed the first outcrop with my knife handle. Lead. I grabbed the heavy, dull gray, or it felt like hope in my palm. I needed 2 more pieces. I moved deeper into the grass, my eyes scanning for the telltale shape of the outcrops. A shadow passed over me. It was massive. I looked up, expecting a stalker, but this was different. It was a sand shark. It looked like a slab of muscle armored with chitinous plates, its underside lined with rows of small, frantic legs. It didn't swim so much as prowl the seafloor, its dorsal fin cutting through the red grass. It saw me and dove into the sand, disappearing entirely. Where is it? I whispered, spinning in a circle. Where did it go? The sand exploded 10 feet in front of me. The shark lunged, its mouth a vertical maw of grinding teeth. I used the momentum of my fins to barrel roll to the left. It missed, snapping at the water where my torso had been. I didn't stay to fight. I spotted the last 2 sandstone rocks near a thermal vent and snatched them up, the lead heavy in my mesh bag. Going up, I yelled, though there was no one to hear. Back in the pod, the Geiger counter on my PDA was already clicking, a frantic rhythmic sound like a mechanical heartbeat. I fed the lead and the fiber mesh I'd harvested from the creep vines into the fabricator. The machine worked with a new sense of urgency, the blue lasers weaving the lead into the lining of a heavy, reinforced suit. I pulled it on. It was hot, bulky, and smelled like scorched rubber, but the clicking on the PDA slowed to a Steady, manageable thrum. Radiation suit equipped. The PDA confirmed. Safety levels. Nominal. Warning, the Aurora remains a high radiation zone. Exploration of the wreckage is not advised without further structural reinforcement. I sat on the floor of the pod, breathing hard. I had survived the crash. I had survived the stalkers. I had survived the explosion. But as I looked out the porthole at the burning remains of the Aurora, I realized something. The ship was the only way off this rock. Somewhere in that radioactive hellscape was the data I needed to build a long-range transmitter or a rocket. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing to go into the heart of the fire. Chapter 5. Signals. The silence following the Aurora's explosion was worse than the roar. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that made the tiny life pod feel like a coffin. I spent the morning watching the Geiger counter on my PDA. The lead line suit was doing its job, but the psychological radiation, the realization that I was likely the last human being alive in this sector, was starting to leak through. Then, the radio clicked. It wasn't a voice. It was just a burst of static, a rhythmic hiss thump that cut through the ambient hum of the pod's life support. PDA, status of the communications relay, I said, standing over the charred remains of the radio console. Communication array is non-functional, the voice replied. Internal sensors indicate a blown fuse and melted wiring. Repair tool required. A repair tool. I checked the blueprint. It required silicone rubber, titanium, and cave sulfur. Sulfur? I frowned. Where am I supposed to find that? This isn't exactly a volcanic wasteland. Cave sulfur is a byproduct of the crashfish species found in shallow cave systems, the PDA informed me. Warning. The species is highly territorial and explosive. Of course it was. Everything on this planet either wanted to eat me or blow me up. The caves were located beneath the coral arches of the shallows. They were dark, winding tunnels where the sunlight only reached in thin, flickering needles. I gripped my flashlight, another fabricator gift, and kicked slowly into the gloom. The walls were covered in a strange, red lichen. As I swam deeper, I saw a bulbous, fleshy plant attached to the rock. It looked like a blooming onion made of raw steak. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the water. A frantic, high-pitched gurgling. Why? The onions popped open. Out shot a fish that was mostly iron-spiked fins propelled by a tiny, frantic tail. It wasn't swimming toward me. It was charging me. Oh, hell. I didn't wait. I turned and kicked with everything my fins had. Behind me, the gurgling grew louder, sharper. I dove behind a limestone pillar just as a muffled boom shook the cave. A cloud of silt and orange scales clouded the water. I waited for the silt to settle, my heart hammering against the inside of my radiation suit. I crept back to the nest. The creature was gone, disintegrated by its own biological fuse. But inside the empty, fleshy husket lay a pile of bright yellow powder. 13. Cave sulfur. Back in the pod, the repair tool took shape in the fabricator's light. It looked like a high-tech soldering iron with a nozzle for welding. I turned to the radio console and pulled the trigger. Sparks flew as the tools laser fused the broken circuits. The display screen flickered to life. A blinking red icon appeared. One unread message. I hit play. Static filled the pod, followed by a voice, distorted, breathless, and terrified. This is Life Pod 3. We've touched down about 1 kilometer from the Aurora. The hull is compromised. We're taking on water. Coordinates are attached to this broadcast. If anyone is out there, please, we've got a sea lie, but we're surrounded by... Oh God, what is that? Something is circling the pod. Please. The message cut off with a sound of tearing metal and a scream that ended too abruptly. PDA, I said, my voice trembling. Can you track that signal? Coordinates uploaded to your HUD. The PDA replied. LifePod 3 is located in the grassy plateaus. Depth, 80 meters. I didn't think about the danger. I didn't think about the sand sharks. For the first time since the Aurora fell out of the sky, I had a destination. I had a purpose. The swim to Life Pod 3 was long. I used the surface for as long as I could, keeping the burning wreckage of the Aurora to my left. When I reached the coordinates, I took a deep breath of tank-filtered air and dove. The red grass of the plateaus swayed below me like a field of blood. I saw the pod almost immediately. It wasn't floating. It was resting on the seabed, tilted at a sickening angle. One side of the hull had been peeled back like a tin can. I swam through the jagged hole. The interior was a mess of floating wires and empty lockers. There were no bodies, no signs of life, just a single, handheld device floating near the ceiling. I grabbed it. It was a Sea Glide, a compact, motorized propeller system with a built-in sonar map. I looked around the ruins of the pod. On the floor, near the exit, I saw a PDA log left by the occupants. I picked it up and hit play, hoping for a clue as to where they had gone. "We're leaving the pod," the voice of a young woman said. She sounded remarkably calm, though her breathing was ragged. "The things outside, they won't stop hitting the hull. We're going to try to swim for the surface. If we don't make it, tell Altera we were doing our jobs." I swam out of the pod and looked up. Between me and the surface, 3 sand sharks were circling, their armored fins cutting through the water. They weren't just scavengers. They were hunters, and I was standing in the middle of their killing floor. I gripped the handles of the Sea Glide and squeezed the trigger. The motor roared to life, and the world became a blur of bubbles and speed. Chapter 6, Foundations. The Sea Glide changed everything. Back in the life pod, I sat on the floor, stripping the mud and salt from my suit. The Sea Glide rested against the locker, a compact, yellow and black engine of freedom. With it, my effective range had tripled. I wasn't a slow, splashing target anymore. I was a blur. But the pod was shrinking. Every piece of titanium I scavenged, every spare battery, and every bottle of water took up precious inches. I was sleeping on a pile of salvaged metal, and the smell of recycled sweat and ozone was becoming unbearable. Survival is 10% equipment and 90% psychology, the PDA noted as I organized my locker for the third time that hour. Extended confinement in a 3-meter space is correlated with a 40% increase in space madness. Space madness? Is that the official Altera medical term? I asked, wiping a smudge off the Sea Glide's sonar screen. The term giddy up gone was also considered. I sighed. What do I need for a habitat builder? Wiring kit, computer chip, and battery. Note, building a permanent residence on 4546B constitutes an unauthorized land claim and will be billed to your estate upon rescue. Put on my tab, I muttered. The habitat builder was a strange tool, flimsy looking like an oversized scanner with a glass nozzle. But as I dove into the water with it gripped in my hand, it felt more powerful than the knife. This wasn't a tool for survival, it was a tool for living. I chose a spot on the very edge of the safe shallows, where the white sand sloped down into the red grass abyss of the plateaus. It was a high-visibility area with plenty of sunlight for the solar panels I'd have to install. I pointed the builder at the sand. A blue, translucent ghost of a corridor appeared in the water. I pulled the trigger. The machine hummed, a high-pitched whine that sent ripples through the water. Nanites swarmed out of the nozzle, knitting the titanium from my pack into solid, shimmering plates. Within 30 seconds, a pressurized, watertight tube was sitting on the seabed. I added a hatch. I added a solar panel on the roof. I swam to the door, my heart racing. I pulled the handle. SSSSSS thump. 15. The airlock cycled. I climbed inside and felt the water drain away. For a moment, it was silent. Then, internal pumps kicked on, and a soft, white light filled the room. I pulled off my mask. The air was cool. It didn't taste like the rubber of my regulator. It tasted like nothing. Pure, filtered, beautiful nothing. I stood in the center of the small, empty tube and just breathed. No rocking of the pod. No sound of waves. Just the steady hum of the bass. "Welcome home, Riley," I whispered. I spent the next few hours turning the tube into a home. I built lockers to organize my oars. I built a small desk. I even fashioned a picture frame using the PDA's interface, displaying a pre-saved image of the aurora before the crash, a reminder of why I was here. But to keep the lights on and the oxygen flowing, I needed more quartz for glass. I stepped back out into the water, the Sea Glide's motor humming as I skimmed along the border of the kelp forest. I was scanning the sand when I saw something that didn't belong. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a plant. It was a pipe, thick, black, and made of a material that looked like carbon fiber but felt like obsidian. It emerged from the sand and curved upward, disappearing into a massive rock formation. I swam closer, my scanner at the ready. Analyzing, the PDA said. Its voice sounded different, sharper. Material, unknown. Origin, unknown. This structure does not match any Altera or known transgov technology. I followed the pipe. It led me to a large metallic vent jutting out of the seabed. A stream of warm, filtered water was pumping out of it. It looked ancient, covered in thousands of years of coral growth, yet the machinery inside was clearly still humming. It's an intake, I said, touching the cold surface of the vent. Someone built this. Someone long before the aurora. Deep scan initialized, the PDA reported, detecting a massive energy signature several kilometers below your current position. The structure appears to be part of a planet-wide geothermal network. I looked down into the dark blue void beyond the reef. I had been so worried about the sharks and the radiation, but I had missed the biggest question of all. I wasn't the first one here, and whoever had been here before me had a level of technology that made Altera look like they were playing with sticks and stones. Suddenly, a strange, distorted sound echoed through the water. It wasn't a roar. It was a digital chime, followed by a series of clicks that felt like they were vibrating inside my skull. Then a voice, hollow and echoing, spoke directly into my mind. "What are you?" I spun around, my Sea Glide's light cutting through the murky water. There was nothing there, just the swaying kelp and the silent, black pipe. I didn't wait to hear a second question. I squeezed the trigger on the Sea Glide and bolted for the safety of my new home. Chapter 7, The Island of Giants. I didn't sleep in my new base. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, the voice, if you could even call, that digital vibration of voice, echoed through my skull. "What are you?" It wasn't a threat. It was a question asked by something that hadn't seen a human in 1,000 years. By dawn, I was packed. I couldn't sit still. The alien pipe had been a neon sign pointing toward a mystery eye. Wasn't ready for, but couldn't ignore. Detecting a massive stationary landmass to the southwest, the PDA informed me as I checked the Sea Glide's battery. "Land." I paused. "You said this was an ocean planet. 99% water." "Correct. However, long-range scans indicate a localized atmospheric distortion, a permanent fog bank that is occluding a significant biological signature. It is moving vertically. Leaving the reef was the hardest thing I'd done yet. The safe shallows were colorful, sunlight-drenched, and familiar. As I gripped the Sea Glide and headed southwest, the seabed didn't just drop off, it vanished. The turquoise water turned into a bruised, bottomless indigo. This was the void, the open ocean where the light didn't reach the floor. I felt like a speck of dust in a cathedral. Every time a bubble popped, or the Sea Glide hummed, I imagined a gargantuan mouth opening beneath my fins. After 20 minutes of white-knuckled transit, the fog began to thin. A shape loomed out of the mist. It wasn't a ship. It was a mountain. But as I got closer, I realized the PDA hadn't been joking about it moving. The island wasn't anchored to the seafloor. It was floating. Beneath the waterline, I saw them. Ancient floaters. They were massive, pulsing organisms the size of houses, glowing with a soft, bioluminescent pink. Hundreds of them were fused to the underside of the rock, their buoyancy keeping thousands of tons of earth and jungle drifting on the surface. I climbed onto a sandy beach, my legs shaking as they touched solid ground for the first time in days. The island was a tropical graveyard. Lush green ferns and bulbo trees covered the hills, but as I hiked toward the highest peak, I saw the glint of titanium. Not the jagged, burnt titanium of the aurora, but weathered, rusted modules. Structure detected, the PDA said, its tone almost solemn. Design matches early Altera deep space. Habitats. Estimated age, 10 years. 10 years. I wasn't the first one to crash here. 17. I climbed a narrow, winding path to the summit. There, perched on the edge of a cliff, was a derelict. Multipurpose room. The glass was cracked, and purple vines had reclaimed the interior. Inside, I found a PDA resting on a rotted desk. I hit play. Day 45. Father is still insistent on building deeper. He thinks the answers are in the dark. But Maida, she's different. She brought back a piece of metal today. It wasn't ours. It was green. Precursor. The voice belonged to a young man, Bart Torgal. He was part of the Degassy crew, a ship that had gone missing a decade ago. I listened to his logs as I looked out over the ocean. They had survived here. They had farmed the land. They had built a life. And then they had gone down. New coordinate data synthesized. The PDA interrupted. Bart Torgal's logs mention a second base, located in a deep-sea cavern. Depth, 250 meters. Before I left the ruined base, something caught my eye in the dirt near the exit. I brushed away the soil and pulled out a heavy, rectangular object. It was a tablet, made of the same obsidian-like material as the pipe I'd seen earlier. A glowing purple symbol was etched into its center. It felt warm to the touch, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that matched the voice I'd heard in the water. Warning, the PDA stated. This device contains an encrypted data pulse. It is not a storage medium. It is a key. I looked back toward the aurora, then down at the purple tablet in my hand. The Degassy crew had followed the mystery into the deep, and it had swallowed them. I had a choice: stay on the island, eat fruit, and wait for a rescue that might never come, or follow the precursors into the dark. I looked at the water. Somewhere down there, the thing that had asked, "What are you?" was waiting. I gripped the tablet, adjusted my mask, and dove back into the blue. Chapter 8. The Maw. The aurora looked different up close. From the safety of the shallows, it was a silhouette of tragedy. Floating next to it, it was an industrial nightmare. The water here wasn't blue or green. It was a murky, stagnant gray, choked with ash, twisted hull plating, and a thick layer of silt that made my flashlight beam feel useless. Radiation levels, extreme, the PDA warned. The Geiger counter was no longer clicking. It was a steady, high-pitched whine. Lead lining integrity is holding. Prolonged exposure is still inadvisable. I'm not here for a tan, I muttered, gripping the handles of the Sea Glide. I was aiming for the jagged hole in the starboard bow. The explosion had peeled the thick armor plating back like a sardine can, creating a ramp of debris that led from the water up into the ship's exposed guts. Then I heard it. It wasn't a roar. Not yet. It was a deep, resonant thrum that I felt in my molars. It sounded like a massive organ pipe being played by a gale force wind. Detecting multiple Leviathan-class biological signatures in the region, the PDA said, its voice dropping. An octave as if it were trying to whisper. Are you certain whatever you're doing is worth it? I stopped the Sea Glide. I need the drive core fixed. If the radiation keeps leaking, the ecosystem dies. And I die with it. You're the one who told me that. I also told you that survival is 90% psychology. Dying in the jaws of a predator is psychologically taxing. I scanned the gray murk. Nothing. Just the groaning of the ship's metal as it settled into the sand. I squeezed the trigger on the Sea Glide and moved forward. I was 50 meters from the hull when the water behind me didn't just move, it displaced. A shadow, longer than the life pod, eclipsed my light. I spun around, the Sea Glide's sonar pinging. Frantically, on the small screen, a massive red shape appeared. It was moving fast. The roar finally came. It was a piercing metallic shriek that sounded like a freight train slamming its brakes on a curve. Out of the silt emerged a face from a fever dream. It was white and crimson, with 4 deep-set mandibles that looked like curved scythes. No eyes were visible, just a sleek, predatory skull designed for one thing, ending whatever it caught. The Reaper Leviathan. It didn't hesitate. It lunged, its mandibles flaring open to reveal a maw large enough to crush a sea moth. I didn't think I dove. I pointed the sea glide straight down, toward the tangle of girders and fallen plating on the seabed. 19. The Reaper's mandibles slammed shut inches from my fins. The force of its movement sent me spinning. I tucked into a gap between 2 massive titanium beams, pressing my back against the cold metal. The creature circled. It was massive, at least 55 meters of pure muscle and malice. It swam with a terrifying, serpentine grace, its long red fins rippling through the ash. It roared again, the sound vibrating. Through the metal beams I was hiding in. It uses echolocation, the PDA whispered. If you can hear it, it can see you. Now you tell me. I hissed. I stayed still, my breath coming in shallow hitches. My O2 was at 40%. The Reaper passed directly over my hiding spot, its pale underbelly a vast wall of flesh. It was looking for the source of the motor hum. It nudged a piece of salvage, tossing the multi-ton plate aside like it was a toy, then spiraled back into the murk, its roar fading into a low, predatory grumble. I didn't wait for a second pass. I kicked out of the wreckage and used the sea glide in short, silent bursts, hugging the hull of the Aurora until I reached the twisted metal ramp. I scrambled out of the water and onto the deck of the Aurora. The heat was staggering. Fires were still, burning in the upper corridors, fed by leaking fuel lines. The interior was a graveyard of Altera tech. I passed the prawn suit bay, where 3 of the massive exoskeletons hung from their docking claws, half-melted and useless. There were no alien rooms here, no mysterious tablets, just the familiar, utilitarian gray of a corporate freighter turned into a slaughterhouse. I made my way to the drive room. The floor was flooded with waist-deep, irradiated water. The massive dark matter generators were humming a discordant, dying tune. I could see the breaches, 10 jagged holes in the shielding, spitting out blue sparks of pure energy. I pulled out my repair tool. One at a time, I told myself, my hands shaking as I waded into the water. For the next hour, I worked in a daze of heat and radiation. I welded the shielding, fused the coolant pipes, and rerouted the power flow. With every breach I sealed, the Geiger counter slowed its frantic ticking. By the time the last hole was closed, the room felt different. The air was still hot, but the heaviness of the radiation had lifted. Drive core containment, 100%, the PDA announced. Radiation leak neutralized. Well done, Riley. Altera has credited your account with 10 good job points. Current debt, 3 billion credits. I'm rich, I wheezed, leaning against the cold metal of the generator. I looked back toward the exit, toward the water where the Reaper was waiting. I had fixed the ship, but I was still a long way from home. And now, I knew exactly what was guarding the gate. Chapter 9. The Mark of the Beast. The heat in the drive room was receding, but the air was still thick with the smell of ozone and burnt insulation. I didn't leave immediately. I couldn't. Fixing the core had drained me, but the PDA was already nagging about the next objective. Riley, internal ship sensors indicate the captain's bridge remains pressurized, the voice said. Data. Logs suggest the Neptune escape rocket blueprints are stored on the primary server. Accessing them is your only viable path to planetary departure. I wiped the sweat from my brow, my glove coming away stained with gray soot. Fine. One more stop. The trek to the bridge was a nightmare of vertical climbing and navigating through flooded corridors. I passed the crew quarters, rows of empty bunks that smelled of stagnant water and old dreams. I didn't look too closely. I couldn't afford to think about the people who had slept there. In the captain's quarters, the room was surprisingly pristine. On the desk sat a small, black data terminal. I slotted my PDA into the port. Downloading, a progress bar flickered. Blueprints acquired. Neptune launch platform, gantry, and fuel reserve. Note: construction requires high-tier materials currently unavailable in your database. We'll cross that bridge later, I said, pulling the PDA out. As I turned to leave, a sharp, stinging sensation flared in the palm of my hand. I hissed, pulling back my glove. In the center of my palm was a small, glowing green cyst. It looked like a pustule of neon light pulsating softly under the skin. It didn't look like a burn. It looked biological. PDA, scan my hand, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. The blue light swept over my skin. The PDA paused for 3 long seconds, the longest silence I'd ever heard from machine. Analysis complete, it finally said. You have been infected with an unknown biological pathogen. Designated CARA. Symptoms include skin irritation, respiratory distress, and eventually total organ failure. Probability of survival without local cure, 0%. I stared at the green glow. I wasn't just a castaway anymore. I was a ticking clock. I had to get back to base. Fast. But the Reaper was still out there, and my O2 was low. I needed more than just fins. In the Aurora's Seamoth Bay, I had scanned the last few fragments of submersible hull. I had the materials in my pack: titanium ingots, power cells, and a lubricated motor. I scrambled back down the debris ramp to the waterline, but I didn't jump in yet. 21. I deployed a small, floating platform I'd crafted earlier, the mobile vehicle bay. It unfolded on the surface, like a robotic lotus for small drones hovering over the water, waiting for instructions. I uploaded the Seamoth blueprint. Initiating construction, the bay chirped. The drones buzzed into action. They began knitting the air itself into a shape, spraying layers of reinforced glass and white titanium plating. Within minutes, a sleek, bulbous submarine splashed into the water. It was the Seamoth 1. I didn't wait. I dove into the water and climbed into the cockpit. The hatch hissed shut, and for the first time in days, I felt a layer of real armor between me and the ocean. Welcome aboard, Captain. The Seamoth's internal computer purred. All systems are nominal. I gripped the joystick and pushed forward. The sub hummed, its electric motor providing a surge of power. That made the Sea Glide feel like a toy. I began to navigate through the graveyard of metal outside the Aurora, heading for the safe shallows. I was halfway through the murk when the sonar went red. HHH. The Reaper didn't come from behind this time. It erupted from the silt beneath me. The massive white mandibles slammed into the Seamoth's hull with the force of a car crash. The glass in front of my face spiderwebbed instantly. The creature didn't just bite, it grabbed. It wrapped its side-like arms around the sub and began to shake it, slamming the hull against the side of a fallen girder. Integrity at 60%. I screamed, struggling to keep my hands on the controls. The Reaper's eye, dark and devoid of mercy, stared at me through the cracked glass. It roared again, a sound that bypassed the hull and vibrated directly into my skull. It wanted me out of the tin can. Not today, you overgrown eel. I hammered the vertical thrusters. The Seamoth groaned, its engines whining as they fought against the Reaper's grip. I toggled the lights to high beam, blinding the creature for a split second. The mandibles slipped. I didn't wait. I slammed the throttle into overdrive. The Seamoth shot forward like a bullet, leaving the Reaper clutching at empty water. I didn't look back until the water turned from gray to turquoise, and the red grass of the plateaus appeared below me. I pulled the sub into the docking port of my base, my chest heaving. I looked at my hand. The green cyst was still there, glowing a little brighter in the dim light of the cockpit. I had the rocket plans. I had a submarine, but I was dying. PDA, I said, leaning my head against the control panel. Where do I find the cure? Data suggests the Degassy survivors were researching a similar pathogen in a deep-sea cavern system. The voice replied, Coordinates locked. Depth, 250 meters. Warning, the Seametha's current crush. Depth is 200 meters. Structural upgrades required before descent. I close my eyes. Always more. Work. Chapter 10. The Edge of the World. The green spots on my arm weren't just glowing. They were spreading. They looked like emerald. Constellations mapped onto my skin. A silent countdown toward a finish line I wasn't ready to cross. I spent the morning in my habitat, my hands trembling as I installed the vehicle upgrade console. Fabrication complete, the PDA announced. Seamoth depth module, 1 Malawian kwacha equipped. Crush depth, extended to 300 meters. Try not to exceed this, Riley. The ocean is very heavy. I'll keep that in mind, I muttered, sliding into the pilot's seat. I had a destination. The Degassy logs had mentioned a cave system beneath the grassy plateaus. A place where they had tried to study the very sickness that was currently eating me. The entrance was a jagged scar in the seabed. I steered the Seamoth down a narrow vertical shaft, the lights of the sub cutting through the darkness until the world turned pink. It was the Jellyshroom Caves. Massive, translucent purple mushrooms grew from the floor and ceiling, their caps glowing with an eerie, rhythmic light. But the beauty was a mask. Detecting high-mass, serpentine life forms, the PDA warned. From the center of a giant mushroom, a crab snake erupted, a long, segmented predator with a face like a bear trap. It lunged at the Seamoth, its teeth scraping against the reinforced glass. I banked hard, the sub's thrusters kicking up a cloud of bioluminescent spores. I found the Degassy base perched on a ledge, half buried in glowing flora. Inside, the air smelled of ancient rot. I recovered a final PDA from a desk layered in silt. It was Bart Torbel's voice again, sounding frantic. The infection is everywhere. It's in the water, the fish, it's in us. We found an alien facility. Further down, something they called the Disease Research Unit. If there's a cure, it's not. Here, it's deeper, always deeper. As the log ended, my own PDA flickered. The screen turned a vibrant, sickly green. A series of geometric symbols scrolled across the display, followed by a voice that sounded like grinding glass. 9 biological subjects designated priority hunt. PDA, translate that. I shouted, my heart hammering. Translation software is struggling with the syntax. The voice replied, sounding uncharacteristically strained. It appears to be an automated broadcast from an orbital or planetary defense network. It is not human, Riley, and it knows you are here. Shaken by the broadcast, I steered the Seamoth out of the caves. I needed space. I needed air. I pushed the sub north faster than I should have, my mind racing through the implications of being hunted by a planet. I didn't realize how far I'd gone until the seabed simply stopped. 23. The colorful reefs and the red grass vanished. Below the Seamoth was a drop-off, so sheer it felt like. Looking off the edge of the universe, the water turned a deep, suffocating black. Warning, the PDA's voice was suddenly cold. Entering ecological dead zone. The organisms in this region are not interested in your survival. I slowed the sub to a crawl. The sonar pings went out and never came back. No rocks, no sand, just the void. Then, a shape emerged from the dark. It was translucent, glowing with a ghostly blue light. A ghost. Leviathan. It was a shimmering ribbon of death, nearly 100 meters long, its hammer-shaped head, turning toward the sound of my motor. It let out a high-pitched, echoing shriek that seemed to pull the heat right out of my blood. I didn't think. I threw the Seamoth into a violent 180-degree turn and hammered the boost. I didn't stop until the sonar showed sand beneath my hull again. Never again, I gasped, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of the cockpit. No more open water. I followed the northern horizon until a massive shape loomed through the fog. It was an island, but unlike the floating one, this was solid rock. And sitting atop its highest peak was a structure that defied every law of human architecture. It was a fortress of black-green metal, hundreds of meters tall, composed of sharp angles and glowing conduits. A massive, swiveling barrel, a cannon the size of a skyscraper, pointed toward the stars. I docked the Seamoth in a natural sea cave and climbed onto the alien pier. The air here hummed with static. As I approached the massive entrance, I pulled the purple tablet from my pack. The tablet vibrated. The door, a shimmering curtain of green energy, dissolved at my touch. I stepped inside. The interior was a cathedral of light and cold, humming machinery. I found a terminal in the center of the hall. As I touched it, the PDA began to translate the scrolling text. Data recovered. The PDA said, "This facility is a quarantine enforcement platform. Its purpose to prevent any infected vessel from leaving the planet. Is the reason the Aurora was shot down. It is the reason we are trapped." I looked at the green spots on my hand. The planet wasn't just a prison. It was a tomb. And the gun above me was the lock on the door. To leave, I had to shut it down. To shut it down, I had to be healthy. And to be healthy, I had to go to the only place left, the center of the world. Chapter 11. The Price of Silence. The air on the mountain island was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient stone. Inside the quarantine enforcement platform, the scale of the machinery was dizzying. Massive, glowing green cables pulsed. With the power of the planet's core, I stood before the primary control terminal. A small, retractable needle hovered over a sensor pad. To disable the weapon, the user must provide a biological sample, the PDA translated. "Easy enough," I muttered, pressing my thumb to the needle. A sharp prick, a second of silence. Then the terminal turned a violent, flashing red. The needle retracted, and a heavy, mechanical groan echoed through the chamber. "Access denied," the PDA said, its voice dropping into a somber tone. "Infected individuals may not. Disable the quarantine. The platform will remain active until the Kara pathogen is neutralized." "I'm the only one here to neutralize it," I shouted at the walls. "Disable the darn gun." The machine didn't answer, but someone else did. The radio on my belt chirped, not the distorted static of a distant signal, but a crisp, clear transmission. "Survivor, this is Avery Quinn of the cargo ship Sunbeam. We've reached the orbit of 4546b. We're seeing that massive structure on your coordinates. Hell of a piece of engineering. We're initiating our descent now. Sit tight, we'll have you home by dinner." My blood turned to ice. I scrambled out of the facility, my boots pounding against the alien metal, and burst onto the black sand beach. "Sunbeam, do not land." I screamed into the radio. "Avery, can you hear me? The structure is a weapon. It's automated. Turn back." Breaking up a bit there, Survivor. "We're entering the upper atmosphere. Picking up some strange energy readings from the surface, but nothing we can't handle. See you on the signal cut to static." High above, a small, bright star appeared in the blue sky. The Sunbeam. As I watched the rescue ship descend, the world suddenly tilted. The sound of the waves vanished, replaced by a deep, resonant humming that seemed to vibrate in my marrow. The beach faded. The sky turned a dark, shimmering teal. A massive eye, larger than the sea moth, opened in the air before me. It wasn't the predatory, cold eye of a reaper. It was ancient, wise, and filled with a profound, aching sadness. Fringes of golden tentacles drifted in a phantom current. 25. "What are you?" The voice wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a ripple in the water of my consciousness. "Many have come here. All have faded. But you're different. I am what you seek. Little sprout. Deep, come to me before the light goes out." The vision snapped. I was back on the beach, gasping for air, the green cysts on my arms pulsing with a rhythmic emerald light. A mechanical roar shook the island. The massive alien cannon atop the fortress began to move. It didn't track the Sunbeam with jerky movements. It swiveled with a terrifying liquid grace. The barrel tilted upward, the green conduits glowing. With such intensity, they blinded me. "Avery, move." I yelled, though I knew it was useless. A beam of pure, concentrated energy erupted from the barrel. It wasn't a projectile. It was a line of green, fire that stitched the sky in two. It hit the sunbeam dead center. The ship didn't just explode, it vanished. For a split second, there was a secondary sun in the atmosphere, a brilliant white flash that rained molten debris down into the distant ocean. Then silence. The cannon swiveled back to its resting position, clicking into place with an indifferent thud. The rescue was over. The only witnesses were the waves and the dying man on the beach. I spent hours sitting in the sand, watching the smoke clear from the horizon. The despair was a physical. Wait, but the vision, the Sea Emperor, had left a map in my mind. A direction. If I couldn't go up, I had to go down. And I couldn't do it in a sea moth. I returned to the shallows, moving with a grim, robotic efficiency. I spent days harvesting. I stripped the Aurora's wreckage for every scrap of titanium. I dove into the deepest crevices for lithium and nickel. Finally, I stood on the deck of my base and deployed the final mobile vehicle bay. Initiating Cyclops. Construction, the PDA announced. This wasn't a submarine, it was a fortress. The drones worked for nearly an hour, weaving a massive 54-meter hull. It was white and yellow, with a bridge that looked like a glass eye and a belly designed to carry a docking bay. When it splashed into the water, the wave nearly swamped my habitat. I climbed. Inside, the interior was vast, a multi-deck command center, an engine room powered by 3 massive power cells, and enough storage to hold a lifetime of supplies. "Welcome aboard, Captain." The ship's deep, baritone voice echoed through the corridors. "All systems. Nominal." I walked to the bridge and gripped the steering wheel. I looked at the sonar. To the south, the seafloor dropped into a massive, jagged entrance, the Lost River. "No more running," I whispered, pushing the throttles forward. "Let's go meet the Emperor." Chapter 12. The Graveyard of Titans. The transition from the open ocean to the Lost River was like descending into a subterranean purgatory. The water turned a sickly, bioluminescent green, choked by a dense layer of brine that sat on the seafloor. Like a toxic fog. "Ahead slow," I commanded. The Cyclops groaned as I maneuvered its massive hull through the narrow cavern entrance. The sonar was a mess of jagged edges and proximity warnings. I kept the sub in silent running mode, the hum of the engine was reduced to a whisper, the internal lights dimming to a tactical red. "Warning, external hull pressure approaching limit," the ship's computer rumbled. "Depth, 800 meters. Just keep it together, big girl," I whispered, gripping the wheel. As the cavern opened up, my floodlights hit something that made the Aurora look like a toy. Rising out of the green brine were ribs the size of skyscrapers. It was the skeleton of a creature that shouldn't have existed, a gargantuan leviathan whose skull alone was longer than my submarine. I steered the Cyclops through the ribcage, the massive bones arching over us like the rafters of a cursed cathedral. Analysis. This organism died approximately 2,000 years ago, the PDA noted. Biological data suggests it was an apex predator capable of consuming entire reef systems. "Glad he's a vegetarian now," I muttered, but my wit felt thin. The green glow from the brine pools below cast long, dancing shadows against the cavern walls. I felt like a parasite crawling through the veins of a Titan. I reached a ledge where the Cyclops simply couldn't go any further. The passage to the alien facility was too narrow, the terrain too jagged. I headed to the docking bay in the belly of the sub. Hanging from the ceiling was my masterpiece, the pressure-resistant atomic works suit, or the prawn. It was a 3-meter-tall, bipedal exoskeleton, armored in reinforced plasteel and tipped with hydraulic claws. I climbed into the cockpit and sealed the hatch. "Welcome aboard, Captain." It is normal when first piloting a prawn suit to feel a sense of limitless power. The suit's AI chirped. "Please remember that it is still possible to die." "Thanks for the reality check." I pulled a release. The suit dropped from the Cyclops, slamming into the seafloor with a heavy thud that kicked up clouds of green silt. Walking in the prawn felt like being a god of iron. I crunched over ancient coral and waded through the acidic brine, the suit's thrusters allowing me to jet across chasms that would have been impossible on foot. 27. I found it embedded in the cavern wall, the disease research facility. Unlike the gun platform, this place looked like it had been through a war. The black-green metal was buckled, and massive cracks ran through the structure. I stepped out of the prawn inside the airlock and gripped my scanner. The interior was a hall of horrors. In the center of the main lab, suspended in stasis fields, were the remains of dozens of species. But one console caught my eye. As I touched it, the PDA's translation hit my HUD in a flurry of terrifying data. Data recovered. This facility was the site of a containment breach 1,000 years ago, the PDA translated. The precursors were attempting to find a cure for Kara by experimenting on Sea Emperor eggs. An escaped Leviathan caused the structural collapse. The infection leaked. Everyone died. They failed, I whispered, looking at the green spots on my hand. They were pulsing faster now. The smartest race in the galaxy, and they couldn't stop it. I moved deeper into the lab, stumbling into a room filled with vats of translucent fluid. Inside the vats were disjointed parts, mechanical blades, glowing internal processors, and raw, purple muscle. I scanned one. The result made my stomach turn. Designation, Warper, the PDA reported. These are not natural organisms. They are biomechanical, killing machines, cyborgs constructed from the DNA of over a dozen different species. Their sole directive, track and eliminate any biological matter infected with Kara. The voice I'd been hearing, the Priority Hunt broadcast, it wasn't just a recording. It was a command. A high-pitched, digital shriek echoed through the facility. I turned just in time to see a ripple in the air. Teleportation gate. A warper stepped through, its purple eyes locking onto mine, its scythe-like blades, deploying with a metallic snick. It wasn't hunting the fish anymore. It was hunting me. I scrambled back toward the prawn suit. I had the coordinates for the final facility, the primary containment facility, located in the volcanic heart of the planet. It was the only place left to go. PDA, I yelled as I hammered the close hatch button on the suit. How deep is the lava zone? Depth, 1,200 meters. The voice replied as the warper's blade slammed against the prawn's reinforced glass. Warning. Prawn suit integrity is the only thing keeping you from being crushed into a very small, very dead cube. Then let's get moving. Chapter 13. The Heart of the Forge. The green mist of the Lost River gave way to a hellish, flickering orange. As the Cyclops descended past the 1,200-meter mark, the internal ambient temperature began to climb. The cooling fans in the engine room were screaming, struggling against the literal wall of heat outside the hull. External temperature, $70 /circ $C and rising, the ship's computer reported. Warning, hull plates are expanding. Structural integrity remains nominal, but uncomfortable. I wiped a thick bead of sweat from my eye. Just get us to the floor. I looked through the bridge glass. We were in a massive, vaulted chamber of black basalt and flowing magma. Rivers of liquid fire cascaded down the walls, illuminating the inactive lava zone with a rhythmic pulsing light. It was beautiful, in the way a forest fire is beautiful right before it consumes you. Suddenly, the power display on my HUD flickered. The 100% charge dropped to 85% in a matter of seconds. Then 80%. What's happening? PDA status report. Detecting multiple lava larvae attached to the external hull, the voice replied. These organisms subsist on electrical energy. They are currently draining the Cyclops' power cells at an accelerated rate. I checked the external cameras. Dozens of translucent, slug-like creatures were latched onto the glass, and the engine housing glowing with the blue energy they were stealing. If I didn't get rid of them, I'd be stranded in a metal coffin at the bottom of the world. I didn't have time to suit up and scrap them off. I did the only thing I could. I toggled the Cyclops shield. Generator. A burst of electromagnetic energy rippled across the hull. The larvae shriveled and detached, drifting into the darkness. Power stabilized, I breathed. But then, a sound erupted that made the larvae look like a miner. Inconvenience. It was a deep, guttural roar that shook the very water around us. It wasn't the shriek of a reaper or the scream of a ghost. It was the sound of a mountain cracking open. Out of the gloom rose the sea dragon Leviathan. It was gargantuan, easily 60 meters of dark, armored scales, and powerful webbed fins. Its head was crowned with horns, and as it opened its mouth, I didn't just see teeth. I saw a glow. The creature exhaled. A concentrated ball of molten rock, a literal fireball that hissed through the water, missing the Cyclops by a dozen meters. Vessel noise is attracting the apex predator, the PDA whispered. Rigging for silent running is highly recommended, and perhaps a prayer. I cut the engines to a crawl, drifting like a piece of soot through the chamber until the dragon moved off to hunt some smaller prey. 29. In the center of the cavern sat the castle, a massive, hollowed-out rock spire surrounded by the thickest lava flows. I parked the Cyclops in a shadowed crevice and boarded the prawn's suit. The suit clattered onto the rock, its thermal reactors immediately picking up the ambient heat and converting it into power. For the first time, my batteries were actually charging while I moved. I climbed the side of the spire, using the jump jet boosters to hop between obsidian ledges. Near the summit, I found it, a geometric doorway of green-black metal, perfectly preserved amidst the volcanic chaos. Inside, the alien thermal plant hummed with a power that made the aurora look like a battery-operated toy. This was the heartbeat of the planet. Every light, every door, and every automated warper on 4546 B was powered by the heat of this volcano. I walked the prawn into the central hub, the floor vibrating with geothermal energy. In the center of the room, encased in a shimmering force field, sat a heavy, rectangular object. It was blue. I stepped out of the suit, the heat inside the facility instantly making my skin prickle. I grabbed the blue tablet. It felt colder than the air around it, a dense piece of technology that hummed with a frequency, so I was almost silent. Data recovered. The PDA chirped as I slotted a backup into the terminal. This tablet is the final key. It grants access to the primary containment facility located in the lower volcanic basin. Depth, 1,400 meters. I looked at the green spots on my arm. The emerald veil of the Kara was reaching my neck. I could feel the fatigue in my bones, a heaviness that sleep wouldn't fix. One more dive, I told the empty, glowing hall. I'm coming for you, Emperor. Chapter 14, The Emperor's Cradle. The descent from the thermal plant felt like dropping into the throat of a god. The water was no longer liquid. It was a thick, shimmering haze of supercritical fluid, distorted by pressures that made the prawn. Suit's reinforced chassis groaned like a dying man. I was at 1,400 meters. The lava lakes. Warning, hull integrity at 85% and dropping. The suit's AI reported. Ambient temperature, $120 / C dollar. It is advised to seek cooler water immediately. There is no cooler water, I rasped. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. The Kara had reached my chest. Every breath was a labored struggle against a tightening knot of emerald cysts. I looked through the reinforced glass. The sea dragon was here, too. Not just one, but a pair of them, circling the massive obsidian structure at the center of the lake. They moved with a slow, ancient lethality, their fireballs lighting up the darkness like depth charges. I used the prawn's jump jets to leap from one cooling basalt pillar to another, timing my movements to the shadows of the leviathans. Finally, I reached the entrance. I slammed the blue tablet into the terminal. The massive doors hissed open, and I tumbled the prawn into the airlock. As the water drained, A profound silence filled the suit. I stepped out, my boots clanging on the clean, white alien floor. This place was different. It wasn't a fortress or a power plant. It was a palace. Massive. Aquariums filled the walls, and the air smelled of salt and ancient ozone. I walked to the edge of a vast central pool. Scan complete, the PDA whispered. Biological signature detected. Massive. Sentient. Peaceful. I looked down into the water. Slowly, a shape emerged from the depths of the pool. It was the creature. From my visions. The Sea Emperor Leviathan. She was gargantuan, hundreds of meters long. Her body, covered in glowing, bioluminescent markings and long, flowing tentacles. Her eyes, gold and vast, locked onto mine. She didn't roar. She didn't hunt. She simply drifted to the edge of the platform and rested her head near my feet. You are here, her voice echoed in my mind, soft as a falling leaf. The others, the ones who built these walls, they could not hear me. They spoke only in machines and needles. But you listen. I'm dying, I said, my voice cracking. I held up my arm, showing her the glowing green rot. Everyone is dying. I know. My children, they are the key. The others tried to force the eggs to hatch. They did not understand. A child must want to wake. It must feel the world is ready. She gestured with a massive claw toward a pedestal at the bottom of her tank. 5 eggs sat there, encased in stasis. They were thousands of years old, waiting for a signal that never came. 31. What do I need? I asked, leaning against the glass. Life. The world is a circle, little sprout. To wake my children, you must bring the essence of the planet to them. 1 from the shallows, 1 from the kelp, 1 from the red grass, 1 from the mushrooms, and 1 from the heat. Blueprints acquired. Hatching enzyme, the PDA chirped. Ingredients. I stock, creepvine seed, red bush, white mushroom, and sea crown. My heart sank. I have to go back? All the way to the surface. The gates are open, the Emperor whispered. She gestured to the corners of the room. From massive archways hummed to life, their green energy. Cores swirling with light. They were phase gates, shortcuts through space and time, linked to every corner of 4546B. I looked at the Emperor, then at the eggs. I'll be back, I promised. The next few hours were a blur of teleportation and frantic harvesting. I stepped through the first gate and was suddenly in the mushroom forest, the cool blue light a shock to my senses. I snatched a sample of a white mushroom and dove back through. Next, the kelp forest, dodging a confused stalker as I grabbed a glowing seed cluster. The grassy plateaus for a sprig of red bush. The safe shallows for an eye stalk. Finally, I found the sea crown, the rarest plant on the planet, hidden in a small crevice within the Emperor's own tank. I stood before the fabricator in the facilities lab, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the samples. The machine hummed, weaving the biological data together into a glowing orange fluid. The hatching enzyme. I swam down to the eggs and smashed the container. The fluid drifted into the water, a golden cloud that settled over the 5 shells. The Emperor watched, her gold eyes shimmering with what looked like tears. 1 shell cracked, then another. 5 tiny sea emperors, barely the size of my torso, burst from there. Eggs. They didn't have the sorrow of their mother. They were pure, curious joy. They swam in circles around me, chirping and bumping against my suit. As they swam, they began to secrete a shimmering, concentrated substance. Enzyme 42. Concentrated. Cure detected. The PDA yelled. Riley, touch it. I reached out and brushed my hand through the golden cloud. The effect was instantaneous. The green cysts on my hand began to fade, the light dimming until my skin was clear and healthy. The weight in my lungs vanished. I was cured. My children are free. The Emperor's voice was fading now, growing distant and weary. They will go to the surface. They will spread the cure. The cycle is complete. She sank back into the depths of the pool, her long life finally reaching its end. She had waited a millennium for this moment. Thank you, I whispered. I looked up toward the surface, far above the rock. And the fire. The planet was no longer a tomb. The quarantine was over. It was time to go home. Chapter 15. The Neptune Ascension. The walk back through the primary containment facility felt different. The air was no longer a weight, and the hum of the alien machines no longer felt like a threat. I was the first human in 1,000 years to breathe truly clean air on 4546b. Behind me, in the great aquarium, the sea emperor rested. She was a mountain of ancient grace, her life force flickering out like a dying star, content in the knowledge that her children were finally swimming toward the sun. PDA, I said, my voice steady for the first time since the crash. Status of the quarantine enforcement. Platform. Biological scan. Negative for Kara pathogen. The voice replied, and I could have sworn there was a hint of pride in its synthesized tone. You are officially cleared for departure, Riley. The planet's lock is waiting for your key. I traveled back through the phase gates, surfacing at the mountain island. The massive black-green fortress still loomed over the ocean, its barrel pointed menacingly at the stars. I walked back into the control room, standing before the same needle that had rejected me days ago. I pressed my hand to the sensor. The needle pricked my skin. A blue light swept over my palm. Target healthy, the facility's hollow voice boomed. A series of deep, mechanical thuds vibrated through the island as the massive power cores began to spin. Down. The green glow in the conduits faded to a dull gray. High above, the great gun groaned, its barrel lowering until it pointed harmlessly at the horizon. The sky was open. The construction of the Neptune escape rocket took 3 days. It was the most ambitious project the fabricator had ever attempted. I built the launch platform first, a massive floating island of steel and thrusters, and then, section by section, the rocket itself. The gantry, a skeletal tower of titanium. The fuel reserve, massive tanks of crystallized sulfur and deuterium. The cockpit, a sleek, white needle designed to pierce the atmosphere. As the final rivets were sealed by the drones, I stood on the edge of the platform and looked at my home. The Aurora was still a jagged ruin on the horizon, but the smoke had stopped. The water around my feet was teeming with life. I saw a group of baby sea emperors breach the surface in the distance there, golden trails curing the water as they swam. 33. I reached into my pack and pulled out a small waterproof container. I had filled it with a few things. A picture of my base, a cured peeper, and a single, glowing seed from the Emperor's tank. I placed it in the rocket's time capsule locker. For the next person who falls, I whispered into the recorder. It's a beautiful world. Just keep breathing. I climbed the gantry and entered the cockpit. The interior was cramped, filled with Altera standard controls that felt surprisingly alien after weeks of using precursor tech. Welcome aboard, Captain, the rocket's computer said. Final systems check complete. Destination, Altera space. Estimated travel time, for months. I sat in the pilot's chair and gripped the throttles. PDA, I said. Thank you for everything. It has been a pleasure being your primary source of snark and survival data, Riley. Please note that, upon landing, you will owe Altera 3 trillion credits for the loss of the Aurora and all utilized equipment. I recommend a very good lawyer. I laughed. A real, genuine laugh. Launch. The engines roared to life. The rocket shook with a violence that made the Aurora's crash feel like a memory. I was pressed back into my seat as the G-force climbed. Outside the viewport, the blue sky darkened into indigo, then purple, and finally the absolute black of space. I looked back. Planet 4546b was a marble of brilliant turquoise and deep sapphire, wrapped in swirls of white cloud. From up here, you couldn't see the Reapers or the radiation. You could only see a world that had tried to kill me, but ended up saving me instead. Goodbye, I whispered. The rocket's thrusters fired again, pushing me away from the gravity well. As the planet shrank into a tiny, glowing dot, I closed my eyes and listened to the silence. I was Riley Robinson. I was a survivor, and I was going home. Bonus chapter: The Scattered Echoes. While Riley Robinson was wrestling with the foundations of his new home, the silence of the ocean was not truly empty. It was filled with the fading pings of distress signals, the dying breaths of the auroras. Crew, this is the story of the ones who didn't see the sunrise. Life Pod 4, The Surface Breach. Occupant, Crewman Keen, unspecified, location, the crash zone. Keen's pod didn't sink. It bobbed on the surface, caught in the shadow of the Aurora's burning engine. Thrusters. The water here was a soup of irradiated ash and slick oil. Keen had survived the impact, but as he stepped out onto the roof of his pod, he saw a mountain of white and red muscle cresting the waves. He didn't have a sea glide. He didn't even have a knife. He tried to swim for a piece of floating wreckage. But the Reaper beneath him wasn't hunting for food. It was defending its territory. The last thing, transmitted from Pod 4, was the sound of rushing water and a mechanical crunch as the Reaper dragged the entire pod beneath the surface like a fishing bobber. Life Pod 17, The Snake's Tooth. Occupant, Ozzy from the cafeteria location, the grassy plateaus. Ozzy was a simple man who knew more about nutrient blocks than alien biology. His pod had landed perfectly on a shelf of rock overlooking a deep, jagged crack in the earth. "I've got something big circling the pod," he had broadcast, his voice shaking. He had been right. Below him lay the entrance to the jelly shroom caves. A crab snake, drawn by the vibration of the pod's distress beacon, had spiraled up from the depths. It didn't bite the pod. It waited. When Ozzy finally tried to swim for a nearby crate of supplies, the snake struck. There was no struggle, only the sound of a bear trap, jaw closing in the dark. Life Pod 19, The Officer's Gamble. Occupants, Second Officer Keen and Crewman Danby location, the Sparse Reef. Keen was the highest-ranking officer left alive. He had landed in the Sparse Reef, a desolate stretch of seafloor at 300 meters. His pod was taking on water, and his oxygen was low. "We're going to the surface," Keen had recorded, looking at Danby. "It's a long swim, but we have to try." They had made it halfway, but at 150 meters, the pressure change and the exhaustion took their toll. Danby's tank ran dry first. Keen had tried to share his air, a final act of brotherhood in the deep blue, but the exertion caused them both to succumb to nitrogen narcosis. They drifted into the abyss, peaceful and dreaming, 2 kilometers away from Riley's base. 35. Life Pod 12, The Geneticist. Occupant, Medical Officer Danby location, the Bulb Zone. Danby was a scientist. He had landed in the Bulb Zone, surrounded by glowing purple orbs and high-voltage predators. He was the first to realize the water was infected with Kara. "The DNA is being rewritten," he whispered into his PDA. "I can see the green cysts. I'm going to try to synthesize a temporary vaccine." He almost did it. He had the samples, the chemistry, and the brilliance. But a bone shark, attracted by the blue light of his fabricator, shattered the pod's reinforced glass. The ocean rushed in, and with it, the bioluminescent predators. Danby died with the cure in his hand, just a different version of the one Riley would find weeks later. Life Pod 2, The Last Hope. Occupants, CTOU and Berkeley location, the Blood Kelp Trench. You was the chief technical officer. She was tough, smart, and a survivor. Her pod had plunged 500 meters deep into a canyon of white, veined vines and eerie silence. "The pod is done for," you told Berkeley. "We're heading for the Degassy base. If we can reach the cave system, we might have a chance." They swam through the blood kelp, dodging the long, spindly legs of the blood crawlers. They were within sight of the cave entrance, the gateway to the Lost River, when a warper appeared. It didn't use teeth. It used space. It teleported you into the path of a ghost leviathan and left Berkeley alone in the dark. Berkeley waited in a small cave for 3 days, calling for a rescue that would never come, until his battery and his hope finally flickered out. The final log. When Riley finally launched his rocket, he wasn't just carrying himself. He was carrying the ghosts of these men and women. Their PDAs, scattered across the sea floor, were the only headstones they would ever have. Riley had survived because of luck, yes, but he had also survived because he had followed the breadcrumbs of their failures. Every empty pod was a lesson. Every final recording was a warning. They were the pioneers of 4546B. Riley was simply the one who finished the map. Secret chapter, the deepest silence. The year was 2035. The Aurora was a distant, rusted memory, half sunken into the dunes of the crash zone. The planet, 4546B, had returned to its natural rhythm, the golden cure of the Sea Emperor's children having long since scrubbed the Kara from the ecosystem. Then, the sky cracked again. It wasn't a capital ship this time. It was a small, long-range scout vessel, the Vesper, caught in a freak gravitational shear. It didn't burn up in the atmosphere. It tumbled, screaming, into the safe shallows, skipping across the water like a stone before settling near a cluster of ancient coral tubes. Elias climbed out of the wreckage, his lungs burning. He wasn't a scientist or an engineer. He was a surveyor. He expected to find a watery grave. Instead, he found a ghost. Directly beneath his crash site, nestled against a limestone outcrop, sat a habitat. It was a sprawling network of glass corridors and titanium multipurpose rooms, covered in a decade's worth of barnacles and glowing sea moss. Elias dived down, his standard issue all-terra oxygen tank, hissing in the silence. He found a hatch that still hummed with a faint, residual thermal charge. Inside, the base was a time capsule. A single poster of the Aurora hung on a wall. A desk held a small, toy-sized model of a prawn suit. And in a locker, Elias found a PDA with a name etched into the casing. Robinson, R. Entry 402. A tired, human voice played back through the dusty speakers. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Either the rocket worked, or the ocean won. If you're the new guy, watch the shadows. They bite back. Elias didn't stay. The base felt too heavy with the weight of the man who had lived there alone. He took a discarded Sea Glide from the rack, miraculously still holding a charge, and headed north. He wanted to see the edge. He wanted to see the world he was now trapped on. Elias pushed the Sea Glide to its limit. The colorful reefs gave way to the blood kelp, and the blood kelp gave way to the void. He reached the great drop-off. The seabed didn't just end. It fell into an infinite, ink-black throat. The water here was cold, bitter, soul-deep cold. Warning, his own PDA chirped. Entering ecological dead zone. High probability of apex predatory encounters. Elias ignored it. He felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the dark. He descended past 500 meters, then 800. The light of the sun was a pathetic, flickering memory above him. 37. He expected the ghost leviathans, the shimmering, translucent ribbons of light Robinson had described in his logs. But the void was silent. No shrieks, no movement. The ghosts were gone, as if cleared away by a larger broom. At 1,100 meters, Elias saw a rib. It wasn't like the skeletons in the Lost River. This rib was still covered in dark, leathery flesh. It was wider than the Vesper. It curved into the darkness like the pillar of a submerged continent. He turned his flashlight toward the source of the bone. First, he saw the eye. It was a vast, milky orb, nearly 30 meters across, reflecting his tiny light with a terrifying, dull intelligence. It didn't have a pupil. It was a swirling nebula of bioluminescence. This wasn't a reaper. This wasn't even a dragon. This was the gargantuan Leviathan, a relic of an era when the planet was a nightmare of scales and teeth, a creature that had been sleeping in the crushing depths since the precursors first touched the stars. Elias froze. The Sea Glide felt like a toothpick in his hand. The creature didn't roar. A roar requires lungs, and this thing was a force of nature. It simply moved. The displacement of the water was so violent it felt like a physical blow. The ribs began to shift, not ribs, but mandibles, each the size of a freighter, lined with teeth that looked like jagged obsidian mountains. Elias looked up one last time. He saw the faint, distant shimmer of the surface where Riley Robinson had once escaped to the stars. The great void didn't scream. It didn't cheer. It simply opened its mouth. The mandibles closed with the sound of a tectonic plate shifting. The Sea Glide's light flickered once, turned red, and then winked out. The ocean returned to its natural state, dark, cold, and utterly silent. Final report. Status of Surveyor Elias. Missing in action. Status of Planet 4546b. Quarantine lifted. Danger level, infinite. Note from Altera. Discovery of the gargantuan Leviathan has resulted in the immediate recategorization of the sector as a no-fly zone. Property of Riley Robinson remains forfeit. The end.